just record. So today's chapter is going to discuss how your hormones control two different things while you exercise. Number one is fuel, and number two is water. So when you exercise, you got to get oxygen and sugars to your muscle fibers, and you got to get water to your cells so that you can break down ATP. And it's hormones that does that. All right. There's a number of different ways that your body can communicate with itself. All right. Through nerves, and nerves are electricity. Usually that happens very quickly. So if your body needs to communicate with itself very quickly, like a reflex, get your hand off the stove or something like that, typically it'll be a neurological response. But if changes need to happen somewhat over time, it will be more so through hormones. So the chapter has a discussion of the different organs or tissues associated with the endocrine system. Then we go through a bunch of different hormone types and their actions. And we talk about the different glands and the specific hormones that those glands create or make or synthesize. And then the chapter talks about the regulation of metabolism or energy, or how your body changes from using sugars to fats and proteins while you're exercising, or when you don't have enough muscle glycogen or glucose in your bloodstream. And then which hormones regulate retention of fluid and electrolytes. So we talked about the neurological system and how the hypothalamus is a link between the neurons and the hormones. But again, here it says the endocrine system, and then a communication system, a nervous system, endocrine system. And then through your hypothalamus, where the nerves innervate and affect your hormones, you have the neuroendocrine system. So like, what are the emergent properties of a system like this? You know, and I would probably say it's homeostasis. It's the fact that your body can maintain some type of level playing field in terms of heart rate, blood pressure, you know, bioenergetics. You know, that's not necessarily a gland making a decision to keep things at homeostasis. Homeostasis is emerging because of the interaction of these systems. All right, you could imagine if you take a glass of water, all right, and the glass is here, and I take a piece of, take a little droplet of red ink, and I drop red ink, bloop, right into the water. Eventually that ink is gonna dissipate throughout the water so that all of the water is gonna have just a little bit of this red dot in it, right? It's gonna dissipate, and then eventually the water will have like a little bit of a pinker hue to it. Right, but when I drop that red ink into the water, it doesn't dissipate immediately. All right, it takes a little time for the water to kind of like spread out and become evenly distributed amongst all of the water molecules. That's kind of like how a hormone works, right? The nervous system is based on electricity. The endocrine is based on chemicals. And the way the chemicals are going to get around is they're going to be released by one of the glands in the endocrine system, and they're going to get around through the bloodstream. It takes a little time for that hormone, though, to travel through the bloodstream to the organs and get accepted by the receptors that are on those organs and actually innervate the tissues. So because your endocrine system is based on chemical communication, a lot of times it's going to respond slower than the nervous system. All right, and the endocrine system is a number of glands that together release hormones that regulate your body. Increase, decrease heart rate, blood pressure, vasoconstriction, dilation, how you're using fats and carbohydrates for fuel, how protein is broken down, and how sugars are distributed in and out of your muscle fibers, and those are all regulated by hormonal interactions. And there are sensors. Now we're starting to talk a little bit about, the endocrine system. The endocrine system is constantly monitoring. How does and if the endocrine system is the pituitary gland, your thyroid gland, your adrenal glands, and which one of those is constantly monitoring the internal environment? And so over here it says, systems theory, but now all of a sudden you're talking again about the endocrine gland doing all of this stuff. And it's like almost now the endocrine system is the hierarchy of your hormones. And so you have this like switch back and forth of terminology, but the endocrine system constantly monitors the internal environment. I think it's probably more likely that the internal environment is able to stay at a particular state of homeostasis because of the endocrine system interacting with the neurological system and all this stuff. And that homeostasis of the internal environment emerges, but I don't think it's the endocrine system constantly monitoring, right? It's just a matter of words. But it controls a number of different things, your endocrine system. Particularly in this chapter, we're going to talk about how your carbohydrate, protein, and fat are broken down for biological energy. And probably on Wednesday, we'll talk about how anti-diuretic hormone regulates fluid balance in your blood and in your cell walls so that you can exercise or continue to have hydration while you're burning up your water for the breakdown of ATP. If anybody has any questions, feel free to come on, Mike. So there are a number of endocrine glands that you might have heard of. One is in the middle of your brain called your hypothalamus, and connected to it is your pituitary gland. The pituitary gland has 3 different sections to it, and we're only going to be talking about 2 of them, the anterior and the posterior pituitary, because your intermediate pituitary gland doesn't really do anything, or they don't know what it does. So, but we will talk about the anterior, or the front of your pituitary, because that's where growth hormone and some other important hormones are released. Thyrotropin, a tropic hormone, thyrotropin, is released by the pituitary gland, and that affects how the thyroid functions. So you see you have your pituitary gland here, where a number of different hormones are going to work on other glands and the release of hormones from other glands. The thyroid gland is going to release triiodothyronine, all right, and thyroxine, and that's T3 and T4. That's what they're like commonly called. And those 2 hormones have a lot to do with how your body breaks down sugars. So as you exercise more and more and more, your body needs more and more fuel and more sugar. So your pituitary gland is going to release thyrotropin. That's going to get to your thyroid gland, and there's going to be a release of T3 and T4, and that's going to allow for your body to break down sugars and fats and free fatty acids and fuel more effectively so it can get some more energy. Your thymus, parathyroid glands, your adrenal glands, pancreas. We'll talk about the adrenal glands is where epinephrine and norepinephrine are created. In your adrenal glands, there's the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. The adrenal medulla is the inside of the gland. That's where your catecholamines, which is epinephrine and norepinephrine, are created. Epinephrine is also called adrenaline. It's because it's made in the adrenal glands, and that's the stuff that makes your heart rate go up and your blood vessels dilate so that you can get more oxygen when you're trying to run away or fight somebody. You get that nervousness. That's epinephrine getting into your muscle fibers. Then also there's the adrenal cortex, which is the outer layer of your adrenal glands, which is where your glucocorticoids and cortisol are created. Cortisol is an important hormone that is utilized by your body to break down protein and use protein for fuel when you don't have as much blood glucose. Also triggers glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. So it helps kind of trade off between using protein, fat, and sugars for fuel. Your pancreas is where insulin is created. And insulin is important in regards to the shuttling and distribution of sugars in your cells and into your liver. And then you have your ovaries and your testes, where estrogen and testosterone are synthesized, and those have obvious anabolic or building up effects, so they build up tissues. So let's talk about the different kinds of steroids. There are hormones. There are steroid hormones, and then there are non-steroidal hormones. Major difference between steroidal hormones is that they are lipid soluble, and all of your cell walls are lipids. So a steroid hormone like testosterone or estrogen can go directly through the lipid bilayer of the cell and go directly through the membranes into the nucleus so that it can start to do what it does. So the way that your muscles get bigger is through steroid hormones, for males, testosterone, and for females, estrogen and growth hormone, which is created in the anterior pituitary. All right, so what's going to happen is you're going to exercise to a particular amount. You got to exercise with a particular intensity. Like if I do bench or bicep curls with my pen, it's not enough intensity to break down the muscle fibers. But if I lift with enough intensity to break down the muscle fibers and create this micro damage, then my body is like, oh man, something has happened. I have micro damage. What am I going to do? How am I going to fix myself? So what it does is it sends hormones from your brain, your anterior pituitary, or for males, the testes in terms of testosterone, and for females, estrogen from the ovaries, and also growth hormone. It sends it to the muscle fibers. And when the muscle fiber is infiltrated, I guess, or is exposed to the hormone, because it's a steroid hormone, can go directly through the bilayer, through the cell wall, and go directly into the nucleus. And when it gets into the nucleus, the steroid hormone messes or changes the RNA, and it mutates the cell. And the mutation is increased growth of actin and myosin in the muscle fiber. So testosterone and estrogen are released because of intense enough exercise to create micro damage to the muscles, and then the hormones go to heal the muscle. Non-steroidal hormones are not soluble in lipids, so they can't cross the membranes themselves. They have to have help. All right, so you have two different kinds of your non-steroidal hormones, all right? Most are non-steroidal hormones, all right? Most are protein or peptide hormones, all right? The amino acid derived hormones, all right, there's only two of them, and they're made in your adrenal gland, in the inside, the medulla of your adrenal gland. Those are epinephrine and norepinephrine. All right, and these are, they kind of work together. And what they do is they make it so that your body is ready to utilize fuel and use oxygen to get out of wherever it is right now and go to a different place. So either fight or flight. All right, so these are your non-steroidal hormones, are either protein or amino acid derived. All right. Now, like hormones are secreted into the bloodstream, like we showed you before, but that means that the hormone doesn't get through all of your blood all at once, right? It takes a little time for the hormone to kind of like dissipate throughout the whole concentration of blood. So, for instance, if this is water and I put a droplet of ink in there, it'll take 5 minutes to dissipate. Same thing with your hormones. Like when we do a warm up, all right, a warm up, I'm trying to do a couple of things. Number one, I'm trying to get their heart rate up. If I get their heart rate up, then their blood is being distributed to their muscles more effectively or faster or more readily or whatever. I'm also trying to get their heart rate, their breathing rate to go up, because if they breathe more, they can get in more oxygen. But I'm also trying to get adrenaline released from their adrenal gland into their bloodstream so that they can change where the blood is being used. Before workout, when they're in the car, they're digesting their food and all the blood is in their stomach. But I want to use adrenaline to help vasoconstrict their gastrointestinal blood vessels and vasodilate their peripheral blood vessels so that we can get blood and oxygen to their muscles. So that's what I want to happen in a warm-up, and that doesn't happen in 3 minutes. This hormone does not dissipate through all of the blood and get to all of the muscle fibers instantaneously, not like an electrical signal. All right, the hormone is secreted a little bit at a time, and then it takes time to get through the bloodstream. So that's typically why you want to have a warm-up that lasts a little bit of time from a hormone perspective, because it takes time for that adrenaline to get to the muscle fibers that it's trying to innervate. All right, and now because these hormones are secreted, little bits at a time, it could be the case that during some parts of the week or some parts of the month or whatever, there's more hormone in the blood than there was before. So these concentrations of hormones are never necessarily going to be consistent, and they can be triggered by things like menopause and other issues. Also, like hormone bursts can be triggered by food intake, exercise, all sorts of other things. Usually hormones are released when there's not enough of that hormone. All right, so if there's too much sugar because somebody just drank, a glass of maple syrup, there's too much sugar, not enough insulin, and that is a negative feedback. There's not enough insulin, so your body changes. It changes to make more insulin. That insulin can attach to the excess sugar, and that insulin and sugar can get brought back to the muscle for utilization or whatever. So because of this feedback, there's the ability to kind of keep your body in equilibrium, unless your body's not able to keep in equilibrium. And then what happens is this negative feedback gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. Like when blood starts to or the sugar starts to pool up in the blood and pool up in the blood and pool up in the blood, and I just can't send enough insulin, my pancreas is broken, or my body is not sensitive enough to insulin, because of my body becomes desensitized because of disruption or destruction of insulin receptors. All right. So if that's the case, then there's no homeostasis and the precursor for disease. So pretty much what type 2 diabetes is when this thermostat of glucose monitoring is broken. It just doesn't work anymore. The pancreas is broken, the body's too insensitized or desensitized to insulin, and then this negative feedback just never stops. All right. All right, and then taking a look at the amount of hormone that's in blood plasma isn't necessarily an indicator of whether or not that hormone is working, because hormones need receptors in order to be accepted. There could be a lot of hormone in the plasma concentration or a lot of insulin in the blood plasma, but if there are no receptors on the muscle fibers, or if the receptors on the muscle fiber or on the cell surface are damaged, then that insulin won't go anywhere. It won't be able to do what it's supposed to do. And then what'll happen is the sugar attached to the insulin won't have anywhere to go in the muscle fiber, so it'll be directed to the liver and switch to adipose fat. Down regulation is when the number or receptors that are working is broken. So just like any drug, if I start taking insulin for type 2 diabetes and I keep eating sugar and housing sugar, then eventually what's going to happen is my pancreas is going to start to fail. It's not going to be able to make enough insulin. And then another thing that happens is the receptors that attach to the insulin start to deteriorate or become ineffective. All right, so there's not enough receptors, and what I have to do is I have to pump more and more and more and more insulin in because my body's desensitized to whatever insulin I am getting. So it's like any drug that you might do. It used to be the case that 2 beers were effective, but then it's 3, and then it's 4, and then it's 5, and so forth. Right. So once you start needing insulin, or once your body becomes desensitized towards insulin, the amount of insulin that you may need to do what you did before might also need to increase. All right. Your body also becomes more effective at using their receptors. So during exercise, actually, there's an upregulation of insulin because there's a freeing up, or it seems as though an opening up of insulin receptors on muscle fiber cells, which kind of improves sensitization towards insulin during exercise. So the amount of hormone that's present in a particular muscle fiber cell isn't necessarily indicative of how well or how much hormone is being used. And every hormone has a particular receptor on the cell surface, and each cell might have 2,000 to 10,000 receptors, but one hormone is only going to attach to a specific receptor, and that hormone and its receptor are known as a hormone receptor complex. Again, complex is something like a system, a hormone connected to a receptor system, and it's the same kind of thing over and over and over. Now, what emerges from the relationship between a hormone and a receptor, what emerges is probably the ability to transport or to move a hormone from one side of a tissue to another side of the tissue, especially in the sense of non-steroidal hormones. So a steroid hormone action, kind of like testosterone or estrogen. Remember, a steroid hormone can go right across the cell membrane. All right. The receptors for the steroid hormone are found in the cell, not at the membrane surface. So this hormone receptor can enter the nucleus right away, binds to the DNA, changes the messenger RNA, and synthesizes actin and myosin. That's only going to happen though if the muscle is like micro damage because of intense activity. So during off-season training, when I want to do hypertrophy, this is what I'm manipulating. I'm manipulating this steroid hormone, either my testosterone or estrogen or growth hormone. I'm stimulating this. That's really what you're doing. All right. If your exercise regimen or your strength and conditioning isn't intense enough to break down the muscle, then this doesn't need to happen, so it won't happen. All right, but if your muscle fibers are breaking down, now that's going to be a different weight for everybody. What we do in the gym is we base the intensity of exercise based on the number of reps you can do. So for instance, if you're, here, I'll show you this 1 second. One second. ACSM hypertrophy graph. Let's see what happens. Oh, here we go. Nice. So what it says here is, let's erase this here. What it says here is if you're trying to work strength, you would want to work between here. All right, between 1 second. Odd. You would want to work between 2 and 6 reps. If you're trying to make your muscles bigger, you would want to work between 6 and 12 reps. If I'm trying to get my muscles more powerful, I would want to work between 2 and 5 reps. If I want my muscles to utilize oxygen better, I would do reps of 13 or more. So you have somebody who's in the gym and they're working on sets of dips and they just did 25 dips, 3 sets of 25. They're trying to get bigger and stronger. They're going to next they're going to do 3 sets of 25. I want to get bigger. They're going to do 3 sets of 30, 3 sets of 35, 3 sets of 40. That's not going to get them bigger. It's not going to get their muscles bigger. The intensity of the exercise has to be high enough so that I can only do between 7 and 12. So if we're working on like arm curls and they can do 15, then I'll say, okay, increase the weight so that you can only do 7. And then work with that weight. And when you can do 7, then you can do 8, 3 sets of 9, 3 sets of 10, 3 sets of 11. Once you get to 3 sets of 11, increase the weight again so that you can only do now 3 sets of 7. Then you build it up and build it up and build it up. So I kind of manipulate the intensity of the exercise so that I'm within this rep range between 7 to 12 reps. And that's how I know that that's going to be a high enough intensity so that I can get this stuff to occur. All right, this steroid release and the synthesis of actin and myosin because of testosterone. So really when I'm doing strength and conditioning training, I'm not necessarily thinking about the weights or the heaviness of the weights. I'm really thinking about how am I going to get the hormone to be released. All right. And then once I'm done with that training, that off-season training goal of of strength and of hypertrophy, then if I'm working on my next goal, which is strength and power, all right, then I'm not going to necessarily be taking in as many calories. I'm not going to be putting on the muscle mass, and I'm going to change my work to rest ratio so that I can get stronger and more powerful without putting any more weight on. Anyway, I would just manipulate this rep, this the number of reps that I do within my set in order to target the hormones effectively. All right, so let's go here. Let's move this back up. Any questions right now? All right, I think we're here. So this drawing is pretty much just reiterating what we said. All right. Now you have a steroid hormone, and there's nothing to stop the steroid hormone from going through the cell wall because it's a steroid. It can go through the lipids. So once the steroidal hormone gets into the cytoplasm, all right, it's going to bind there to a specific receptor in the cytoplasm. All right, and that receptor is going to bring it through the nucleus. And then that hormone receptor complex is going to activate the cell's DNA. All right, and it's going to change the messenger RNA. The messenger RNA is going to leave the nucleus and enter the cytoplasm. And then that's where back in the cytoplasm, where the mRNA is going to allow for more actin and more myosin to be created. So that's typically how a steroidal hormone is going to enter a cell and leave its changes. A non-steroidal hormone is not lipid soluble, so it cannot cross the cell membrane as easily. There needs to be something that's going to receive or a receptor for that particular hormone, and that's called a secondary messenger. And that secondary messenger is going to bring that hormone into the cell and allow for that hormone to interact with the DNA of that particular cell. All right, one common second messenger is cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or CAMP. All right, and what CAMP helps do is it helps with ATP. It helps make it so that you can have an increase in your ability to utilize glucose and carbohydrate for fuel. All right, so typically a non-steroidal hormone, all right, is going to attach to one of those secondary messengers, and it's going to be ushered into the cell. So a non-steroidal hormone is going to attach here to its secondary messenger. A secondary messenger in this case is CAMP. All right, with ATP and CAMP, the cell can change this specific hormone to a protein kinases and allow for these substrate changes to occur so that you can utilize carbohydrate and protein. In any event, the important part is that there are these secondary messengers, and the secondary messengers can take things like adenosine monophosphate, and these are remnants of the breakdown of ATP, all right, and it can use to other cellular changes and effects, all right. So either a steroidal hormone doesn't need one of these receptors because it's lipid soluble, or a non-steroid hormone, which is not lipid soluble, will need to be ushered in by one of these secondary messengers. There are other types of hormones called prostaglandins, and they're associated with like injury response. So they're local. They don't necessarily act across the entire, all of the tissues of the body, but they act in regions of tissues and are usually respond somewhat immediately to swelling, pain, injury, and things like that. So there is another type of hormones called prostaglandins. All right, so now what we do is we start to talk about specific endocrine glands and the hormones that they secrete. And some endocrine glands, like the pituitary, the anterior pituitary gland, secrete more than one hormone. And sometimes each of those hormones interact with each other. It's more like a hormone system than it is one hormone interacting without impact of another. So during exercise, there are a number of different hormones that are responsible for fuel, how your body burns fuel. The anterior pituitary, the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland, and the pancreas. The anterior pituitary gland is going to secrete thyrotropin, and thyrotropin is going to impact the thyroid, thyrotropin. A tropic hormone is a hormone that affects a different gland. So thyrotropin is released by the anterior pituitary gland to affect how the thyroid functions. And the thyroid is going to release triiodothyronine and thyroxine, and that's going to make it so that the body burns fuel faster. Same thing with the adrenal gland, is going to release the catecholamines, norepinephrine and epinephrine, and they're going to work with the thyroid gland to make it so that you get more fuel and more oxygen. The pancreas is going to release insulin to deal with sugar, but also it's going to release glucagon. And if there isn't enough sugar, the pancreas is going to release glucagon. That's going to get to the liver, and that's going to make it so that the liver goes through glycogenolysis or gluconeogenesis so that we can get some more sugar into the bloodstream. In any event, in regards to metabolism or the burning of fuel during exercise, these are the major glands. Okie doke. Then there's this video, I believe it's up online. Go take a look at this. And then we start talking about the anterior pituitary gland. So the anterior is the front of the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is attached to the top of the thalamus, the hypothalamus. There's three lobes, the anterior, the intermediate, and the posterior, but we don't really talk too much about the intermediate because we don't really know what it does yet. But the anterior and posterior lobes of the pituitary are very important. All right. It is also connected very carefully or very intricately to the hypothalamus. But remember, the hypothalamus is also connected to neurons. So the hypothalamus and the hormone, the neurological and the endocrine glands are connected here. All right, and exercise is a trigger which increases the secretion of all of these anterior pituitary hormones. All right, so during exercise, there's a release of growth hormone for males and females. And for females, there's not as much testosterone, so much more of protein synthesis during exercise and hypertrophy for females is because of this growth hormone. It's an anabolic hormone, which means that it builds stuff up. And what is the stuff that it builds up? Muscle, protein, actin, myosin, your tissues, ligament, tendon, and all of the organs. And it promotes muscle growth. And muscle is like growth is trophy, and hyper is a lot of growth. So growth hormone is released by the anterior pituitary gland during exercise so that we can have tissue growth, no tissue breakdown, muscle growth, and burning fat. Because if I'm exercising, it could be the case that I don't have as much blood glucose, or if I'm exercising for a long period of time, my blood glucose values are dropping. So I need to have something that's going to get it so that my adipose fat or my lipids start breaking down through lipolysis. So growth hormone is going to start to kind of trigger or initiate that response as well. Increased exercise intensity equals increased growth hormone. And you see right now that growth hormone is like a supplement that people are taking. but you can increase your natural growth hormone values by increasing exercise intensity. So perhaps if you're worried about your growth hormone values, switch to high intensity interval training as opposed to, running for 35, 45 minutes at a moderate intensity. Increase exercise intensity, and that might alone increase your release of growth hormone. Your thyroid gland, like we said before, secretes triiodothyronine and thyroxine, T3 and T4. All right, what those do is it increases your metabolic rate. All right, it increases the speed at which your tissues are going to break down sugars, fats, and proteins to be utilized for fuel. It's also going to start to increase protein synthesis, which is muscle growth. And it's going to increase the number and the size of mitochondria so that you can build more ATP with oxygen. It's going to trigger sugars being absorbed by the cells so that the cells have more fuel for energy. And it's going to increase the rate at which your muscle glycogen is broken in half and switched to glucose, or the way that your proteins and remnants of ADP and ATP are connected together to make more glucose from amino acids. So everything that's going to need to happen so that your body can run, get out of where it's supposed to be right now, so that it increase oxygen, fuel, and oxygen and fuel to the body. That's what triiodothyronine and thyroxine are going to do. And those are going to be triggered again by that thyrotropin, which is created in the anterior pituitary. That's the next slide anyway. So the anterior pituitary is working together with the thyroid, again, another system, and it releases thyrotropin. Thyro is the thyroid, and tropin is a hormone that affects another gland. So thyrotropin is also called the thyroid stimulating hormone. And when exercise happens, thyrotropin travels to the thyroid gland, and it stimulates the release of T3 and T4, and that's going to be responsible for the increase in utilization of muscle glycogen, liver glycogen, the creation of more sugar in the plasma so that the body can use it for energy. It's pretty much just making fuel available for exercise. Then you have your adrenal cortex. Your adrenal gland. Your adrenal gland is right above your kidneys, and your adrenal gland has a couple of different parts to it. It has your adrenal medulla, which is the inner part, and it also has your adrenal cortex, which is the outer part. In the inner part of your adrenal gland, your adrenal medulla, is where your catecholamines are created. And catecholamines are also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. And there's much more epinephrine being pumped through your body than there is norepinephrine. Epinephrine is also called adrenaline. All right. If you increase your exercise, you increase your sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic, remember, parasympathetic has the one that has the part of the P that goes down. The sympathetic nervous system is the one that makes everything go up. It's the fight or flight. It's get oxygen, get fuel to your muscles so that you can run and get out of there quickly. So increased exercise is going to increase your sympathetic nervous system. It's going to increase your heart rate. It's going to increase your breathing rate, increase vasodilation of your peripheral vascular, cardiovascular system. It's going to reduce the blood flow sent to your intestines. It's going to increase glycolysis, gluconeogenesis. It's going to increase the utilization of fats for fuel. So that's what catecholamines are going to do. It's increase oxygen and fuel so you can get out of wherever you're at. So those are the changes that catecholamine release increases, those things. Those are the things that I just mentioned. So that's what's released by your adrenal medulla. Your adrenal cortex is going to release corticosteroids. All right. An example or a kind of corticosteroid is a glucocorticoid. And these glucocorticoids are going to help with the redistribution of free fatty acids to the mitochondria so that you can use protein for fuel. So in a situation where you do not have enough blood sugar, or there's not enough fuel for working muscles for, like, say for instance, long-term endurance exercise, the cortisol is going to help create new sugars or allow for gluconeogenesis to happen from broken down remnants of protein. It's also going to help increase free fatty acid mobilization. So that means that fatty acids are going to go from adipose tissue back to the muscle cells so that you can use fat for fuel when there's not enough sugar. It also protein catabolism. Catabolism is the breakdown of stuff. So cortisol is going to help help the breakdown of protein in your diet. But if you don't have enough sugar or enough fat, it's also going to help break down your own fuel, your own muscle mass for fuel. All right. Feel free to interrupt me at any time. I know there's a lot of content here, but I mean, we got to get through it at some point. All right. Insulin is released by your pancreas. When you eat sugar, what insulin or the pancreas does is it releases an amount of insulin, and the insulin is supposed to attach to your sugar cells and transport it to the muscle. But if I don't have muscle because I'm severely atrophied, then there's no place for the glucose to go. Or if the insulin brings the glucose to the muscle, but I'm not exercising, then the glucose isn't going to be used. So if that's the case, then the insulin is going to bring my excess sugar to the liver. And what the liver is going to do is it's going to change the excess sugar, excess fuel, to something that we can store it as. And it's going to switch the excess glucose. First, it's going to switch it to glycogen, muscle and liver glycogen. Right? Store a little bit of it like that for quick use when it needs to, but it's going to store a lot of that excess glucose as adipose fat. All right, hyperglycemia is too much sugar in the blood. So insulin counters that. If I eat too much sugar, spoonful after spoonful after spoonful of sugar, my blood glucose concentrations are going to go way up. So what insulin does is it attaches to those sugars and tries to do something with it. Number one, bring it to the muscle for fuel. Number two, bring it to the liver to store as glycogen. And number three, break it down so that I can store it as adipose fat and potentially go through glycogenolysis or gluconeogenesis later. All right, the pancreas also releases glucagon. And what glucagon does is it raises blood glucose. So insulin lowers blood glucose by taking any of the sugar that's in the blood and redistributing it elsewhere. What glucagon does is it realizes when there's not enough blood sugar. And what that's going to do is it's going to go to the liver and it's going to trigger this glycogen, muscle glycogen and liver glycogen lysing, breaking down, glycogenolysis, breaking down any muscle or liver glycogen so that I can have some blood sugar. That's going to raise blood sugar. And also gluconeogenesis. Gluco is sugar, neo is new, and genesis is creation. So if I don't have any or enough blood sugar at all, then glucagon will counter the effects of insulin, because what glucagon will do is it will trigger the creation of glucose from other other minerals or other um, amino acids or other things that are broken down from metabolism. Okay, during exercise, if I don't have sugar, my tissues are not going to have fuel to burn. So they're going to find fuel somewhere. And what's going to happen is either the insulin is going to bring glucose to the tissues, or the muscle glycogen is going to break down through glycogenolysis so that I can have glucose, or I'm going to get glucose through gluconeogenesis. In regards to like keto diets and things that have very low blood, very low amounts of carbohydrate in the diet, this is typically where your brain and your body will get fuel for protein, because fats and proteins that I have in the diet will go through gluconeogenesis and eventually get turned to sugar anyhow. So I kind of think that as long as you're exercising and you have muscle mass, then a 50%, 30%, 20% carbohydrate, fat, protein diet is probably the most reasonable. But this is the basis of all of your keto diets or low carb or high carb diets or whatnot. All right, so in order to exercise, especially if you're doing exercise for a long period of time, remember, your body is only storing about 2,500 calories of sugar per day. So in order for exercise to occur, especially long bouts of exercise, it could be the case that my liver and muscle glycogen stores need to have some way of redistributing, recreating, and circulating that that glucose, which is the responsibility of those hormones: glucagon, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. They work together to make it so that either gluconeogenesis or glycogenolysis occurs, or that there's an increase in the rate of breakdown of those sugars, or that free fatty acids and protein are used to recreate losses in circulating sugar because of exercise. And then also glucose during exercise is affected by growth hormone, triiodothyronine, thyroxine. Increased exercise is going to increase the blood concentrations of each one of these. And because I'm increasing exercise, I'm burning more fuel. So what growth hormone is going to do is it's going to trigger the mobilization of free fatty acids outside the in the bloodstream towards the mitochondria, so that they can go through beta oxidation and get broken down into acetyl-CoA and go through the Krebs cycle. And there's also an increase in T3 and T4, which is also going to increase glucose breakdown, catabolism, and the utilization of fat. But again, each one of these is dependent upon the intensity and the duration of exercise, right? So if you're trying to get natural increases in growth hormone, one way that you could potentially do it is by increasing the intensity of exercise, which is one of the reasons why high intensity interval training is functional, right? Not only does it increase cardiovascular fitness and health at the same rate that running for a longer period of time does, it takes far less time to do so, and it also positively impacts growth hormone because of the increased intensity of the exercise bout. With increased exercise intensity is an increase in norepinephrine and epinephrine, and all of the responses that occur with that, which is the increased production of glucagon or glucose from glycogenolysis, the increased breakdown of liver and muscle glycogen so that you can utilize that for fuel, And as the exercise duration increases and more liver glycogen is utilized, there's going to be an increase in the muscle glucose uptake and also the increase in the glucose that the liver releases. So exercise intensity and duration has a lot to do with the release of hormones and therefore the utilization of substrates and fuel during exercise. And I guess right here, I think this is probably one of the last slides that we'll do today. You'll notice here that as the exercise time continues, this over here is glucose. You'll notice that there's not a huge reduction in the amount of glucose in the bloodstream, although the contribution and the concentration and the introduction of each of the hormones into the bloodstream happens at a very different rate for some of them. And it does not necessarily occur for the entire bout of activity. You'll notice here that cortisol, about 30 minutes into the bout of activity, starts to really ramp up with a pretty high rate here, pretty high slope, but then its contribution starts to drop. When you compare that to adrenaline, adrenaline has a continuous increase all the way to the end of the bout of activity. So the way that each of these hormones is diffusing through the tissues is different. Each hormone has a particularly different, I guess, functionality or trajectory, but they all work together. All of these are working together to allow for this concentration of glucose within the bloodstream to level out, to become homeostatic, to stay the same. Now, I don't know whether or not it's epinephrine that makes the decision to help this happen, or whether or not it's the adrenal gland, or whether or not it's the pancreas, or whether or not it's the anterior pituitary or whatever. All right, it seems as though they're all working together, and what emerges is this continuous presence of glucose in the bloodstream so that the body can continue to use it as fuel. Right, I would say that that's probably the emergent property of all of these things working together. Okay, so one of the things that we want to consider is that the insulin is not only going to the muscle, but insulin is also going to other tissues, right? Insulin is going to go to your brain. And when the insulin goes to your brain, what it's going to do is it's going to impact other hormones in your brain. And some of those hormones are responsible for the sensation of being full or being satiated or being thirsty. So when insulin gets to your brain, what it does is it tells your brain a couple of different things. Number one, it tells your brain that, man, we don't know when we're going to get this sugar anymore. We don't know when our next bout of carbohydrate is going to be. So let's try to take in as much as we can. So there are responses that insulin has at your central nervous system level that are going to trigger your body to eat more sugar. All right. So when you start eating candy corn and you can't stop, it's not because you don't have good willpower. It's because there are parts of your brain that are being affected by your insulin. The insulin's telling your brain, keep eating that, keep eating that. Have a couple more because we don't know when you're going to get it again. And then insulin also, when it gets to your brain, impacts your sleep centers or your frontal lobe, in the sense that what it does is it says, now that you have this sugar, let's try to conserve the calories that we've just taken in, and let's try not to exercise as much. Let's try to like take it easy a little bit. So there are other responses that insulin has that are not just metabolic. Sometimes there are psychological aspects of these hormones traveling through your bloodstream as well. So um, let's see where we're at. All right. So one of the things that you'll see is during exercise, sometimes, let's see here. Sometimes this doesn't have insulin here, but sometimes during exercise, you see each one of these hormones is increasing. Cortisol increases for a little while, but then decreases. You'll notice here that glucose doesn't really increase or decrease. Sometimes during exercise, insulin concentrations can decrease. You would think, well, that doesn't make any sense because I need more and more glucose. So why wouldn't it be the case that if I need more glucose as fuel during exercise, that the insulin concentration in the bloodstream would also increase? Well, when you look, it actually seems as though the insulin concentrations decrease. And the reason they say that is because the insulin sensitivity at the cellular level increases. So it seems as though there could be some of those messengers to insulin. Remember, your catecholamines are epinephrine and norepinephrine, and those are steroidal, but insulin is non-steroidal. So there needs to be not only the receptors, but the secondary receptors need to be activated. And it seems as though what exercise does is it increases the number of receptors, insulin receptors at the cellular wall level. So more glucose can be utilized into the cell, but not necessarily more and more insulin released by the liver. So this is typically what the graph of glucose will look like during exercise. So as exercise time increases, the amount of glucose, this can be released as muscle glycogen and by the liver. And as the amount of exercise or in terms of time increases, there can be a small reduction in the amount of glucose, but there's no necessarily increase in the insulin concentration here because the increased ability to utilize insulin here is now more of a function of the reception of insulin at the cell wall level that increases as opposed to the increase in concentration itself. If you're exercising and you have low glycogen levels, then you're going to need fat as a fuel. And there are a number of hormones that speed up this lipolysis or speed up the utilization of stored adipose fat for fuel. Because triglycerides, your three glycerol backbones, can be broken down into free fatty acid plus glycerol. So this is a glycerol with three fatty acids connected to it. These fatty acids can go through your can go through your beta oxidation and utilize for fuel. And glycerol can get broken down in the liver through gluconeogenesis and be made into blood sugar if needed. All right. So if there isn't enough muscle glycogen and free fatty acids need to be utilized for fuel, all right, there are other hormones that can do that as well. All right, some of these are insulin, epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, and growth hormone. All right, and lipase is an enzyme that is needed for this breakdown of lipolysis to happen. All right, but lipolysis is going to be stimulated again by insulin, or the decreased amount of insulin, which is going to also trigger the amount of glucagon. So lipolysis is going to be stimulated at the same time that your gluconeogenesis is occurring. But the same hormones that are going to increase the utilization of sugars are also going to start the utilization of free fatty acids in preparation for the sugars being wasted away. All right, and then we get into our regulation of fluid and electrolytes. And I wouldn't mind if I could stop here for the day, because it gives us a good spot to start on Wednesday. Does anybody have any questions or anything? I think that's a good spot to stop.